Greetings and welcome on behalf of the Lumen Christi Institute. My name is Michael Le Chevalier and I serve as acting executive director here. Lumen Christi was founded in 1997 by Catholic scholars at the University of Chicago, and our mission is to make the Catholic intellectual tradition in its depth and breadth a living dialogue partner across intellectual disciplines here at the University of Chicago and across the academy and within our broader society through courses, lectures, summer seminars, and virtual events like these. Today's event is part of an ongoing series that sets economics in dialogue with Catholic social thought and the broader Catholic intellectual tradition. This event is being recorded and will be posted to YouTube, and I encourage you to share it with colleagues and friends who are unable to participate today. If you want to revisit any previous videos in this series, you can find them on our YouTube page. This morning's program wouldn't be possible without a number of organizers and co-sponsors who've helped to ensure its success. This event was organized by the Lumen Christi Institute and the Catholic Research Economist Discussion Organization, or CREDO, and co-sponsored by Global Researchers Advancing Catholic Education, or GRACE, the International Office of Catholic Education, OIEC, the International Federation of Catholic Universities, IFCU, the World Organization of Former Students of Catholic Education, OMAEC, the World Union of Catholic Teachers, UMEC-WUTC, the International Catholic Child Bureau, BICE, the Q School of Global Affairs at the University of Notre Dame, America Media, the Collegium Institute, the Harvard Catholic Forum, the Nova Forum, the St. Anselm Institute, and the St. Benedict Institute. I now have the pleasure of introducing Quentin Wodon, who will lead our program with a presentation on a new global report on integral human development, prepared by the Global Catholic Education Project. Quentin Wodon is a lead economist with World Bank's Education Global Practice and a pro bono project manager with the International Office of Catholic Education. He previously managed the World Bank Unit on Faith and Development, served as lead poverty specialist for Africa, and worked as a senior economist for Latin America. He has taught at the University of Namur, American University, and Georgetown University, and served as distinguished research affiliate with the University of Notre Dame. He holds PhDs in economics, environmental science, health sciences, and theology, and has authored more than 500 publications. Quentin, at this time, I would invite you to unmute yourself and to turn on your video.
Thank you, Michael. So thank you again for organizing this webinar. And let me try to share my screen so that you can all see the PowerPoint that I'm going to use. I hope that you can see it now. And let me magnify it. So the idea was to start with a 20-minute presentation to frame the discussion with our panelists. And as Michael mentioned, this presentation is about a forthcoming report on integral human development. It would actually be great to get suggestions from some of you on some of the particular aspects that we are going to discuss. Now, the background, as Michael mentioned, I work on a pro bono basis for the Global Catholic Education Project. And the project has essentially two aims: to inform the international community about Catholic education and integral human development, and then conversely to inform Catholic educators and IHD practitioners on good practices that come from international experience. We had two webinars with the Lumen Christi Institute and a number of co-sponsors in January and February on Catholic education. And today, the idea is to broaden the topic to integral human development. I want to say a special thanks to our various sponsors, and of course to Katherine Marshall, Patrizio Piraino, and Diana Filatova for being part of the panel that will follow this brief presentation. The Global Catholic Education Project, I should mention, was created in collaboration with 4 agencies, OIEC, IFQ, OMAEC, UMEC, which are all representing one component, if you will, of Catholic education at the international level. So when we had the presentation in February, and some of you may have attended that presentation, the focus was on one set of reports, the Global Catholic Education reports. We have done 2 issues so far, and there was a discussion about trends in enrollment in Catholic schools and Catholic universities globally, as well as a special topic on education pluralism, learning poverty, and the right to education. Now, one of the findings of that report that we shared a few months ago was that when you look at K-12 education, that is education from kindergarten to 12th grade, there has been continuous growth over time in the number of children enrolled in the schools, and that growth was really happening mostly in sub-Saharan Africa. On the other hand, for universities, there was also a lot of growth in the role played by Catholic universities in enrollment, but only a very small part of the total enrollment was in Africa. Most of it remained in the Americas, Asia, and Europe. Now, for this report, which is the first in what we hope will be a set of annual reports. For this report on integral human development, the first idea is to share some broad trends, again in education, but also in health and in social protection. And so the first 3 chapters of the report will discuss where and how the Catholic Church provides a wide range of services related to human development, broadly speaking. And then, as was the case for the Global Catholic Education report shared earlier this year, there will be a special topic. And the special topic for this report is safe and inclusive schools as a foundation for integral human development. There will be a discussion about why we absolutely need to invest more in children, an economic argument, but a moral argument too, and then a discussion about how to make schools safer, to reduce violence in schools, and then how to make schools more inclusive with respect, for example, to gender or to faith or to disability or to sexual preference, many different dimensions. So let me start with some basic facts about the large footprint of the Catholic Church in terms of providing services. And some of you may know these figures, but actually probably many may not. And the Catholic Church publishes every year an annual statistical yearbook. This has data until 2018. I will add 2019, which is now available. But first, for the number of schools, and I'm using here the number of schools as opposed to the number of students enrolled in school. And the reason for that is because for health and for social protection, we only have data on the number of facilities, not the number of people using the facilities. But essentially for schools, what you see here are trends over time and by region in the number of preschools and the number of primary schools. And if you go for secondary schools, you have similar trends. Essentially, this repeats the message of the Global Catholic Education report that found that Africa was the region with the largest growing enrollment of children in K-12 schools. And of course, that also is reflected in the growth in the number of schools for pre-K versus primary versus secondary. Most of that growth is happening in Africa. No surprise, the same result as what we had before, but very important to think about how we support the Catholic Church in providing those services in a region, Africa, and especially Sub-Saharan Africa, where the challenges for quality are really major. Now, what is new is that we actually have the same data on health facilities, and the data are available for each country, and thereby we can aggregate it by region for the number of hospitals, the number of health centers, and then a third category, which is much smaller, which is leprosaries. What you find here essentially is that not as much, but the direction is the same. Africa is again the region where you have the largest growth in the services provided by the Catholic Church in terms of hospitals and in terms of health centers. What you do see, though, is that in some of the other parts of the world, whether this is because some facilities are closing or whether they are actually merging, you have a decline, for example, in the number of hospitals that are affiliated with the Catholic Church. These next graphs are about leprosaries, where there is a decline, which is not surprising, given that this is much less of an issue than 30 or 40 years ago, but the leprosaries are a very small part of the total. So the basic story for healthcare is that as for education, the presence of the Catholic Church is especially important in terms of growth, but also in terms of what you would call market share or provider share in Africa. Now, in social protection, it's a little bit different. And the data are available, again, not on the number of people served, but in the number of facilities. For orphanages and for nurseries, the story is essentially one of growth in the developing world, and especially again in Africa, but also in Asia. And the status facts are a bit similar between the two categories. The other types of social protection facilities, or broadly speaking, human development facilities that are managed by the Church, one is a set of centers for matrimonial advice. Another one is a set of nursing homes or places that welcome people who might be severely handicapped or chronically ill. And for those categories, you can see that the role played by Asia and Africa, and particularly South Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, sorry, is actually much smaller compared to what is happening in terms of the number of facilities in Western countries by and large. We also have information on centers for social reeducation and then other institutions. There are definitional issues whereby the categories are changing a bit from year to year, and that explains those big jumps. But again, this is something that is much more present in the Americas and Europe than elsewhere. And this is the total trend. So for those type of facilities, the story is a little bit different in terms of the fact that they have not grown yet as much in Africa and South Asia, but that is happening. Now, the discussion in the report on those trends is much more detailed. I just wanted to give you the broad figures, but essentially those networks, as many of you know, are extremely large. We are talking about 226,000 schools, 21,000 healthcare facilities, and 82,000 social protection facilities. With growth in Africa, especially for schools and health facilities, and a bit of a different story for what relates to social protection. Now, I'm not going to be able to go in details in terms of what we find from household surveys, but I want to give you a few pointers. The provider shares, or the magnitude, if you will, of the services provided by the Church are especially large in low-income countries and sub-Saharan Africa, especially for schools and healthcare. Whether Catholic facilities manage to reach the poor is a bit of a debate. It is very clear, and we have many anecdotal examples of efforts to reach the poor, but at the same time, in many cases, Catholic facilities, especially in education and health, reach the poor less than the public sector. And the reason is because there is often a need for cost recovery because of low levels of funding by the state for those networks, right? And at the same time, the Catholic facilities are much more pro-poor than other private facilities. And that is the case typically, again, for education and health. I mentioned the issue of the cost for households, which depend a lot on the type of financing available from the state. In the case of education, actually, in Africa, most of the Catholic schools are public schools that are funded by the state. And if you think about health services, you have what is called Christian health associations in Africa that are combined between Catholic, Protestants, and Christian denominations broadly. And in some cases, they benefit from this support from the state. In other cases, they do not. Now, one thing that is very important is that the rationale for using those facilities on the part of parents, right, whether they send their children to school or whether they use facilities, is fundamentally different between education and healthcare. On social protection, there is a bit less data. On education, the reason to send your child to a Catholic school or an Islamic school, actually, or a Protestant school is in large part because of the issue of values and faith, the importance that those schools place on values and faith. By contrast, the reason why some people choose to go to a Catholic or actually, again, an Islamic or a Protestant or another faith-based healthcare facility is not because of the issues of values of faith, or not directly. It is an issue of the quality of the services being provided and the respect for the dignity of the person. I mean, this is a value, but it's not, it's really a quality of service reason, as opposed to the idea of transmitting your faith and your values to your children. Now, the specific case of education, where values and faith play an important role, also mean that they are foundational for integral human development, which I'm not going to define here, but you know that it refers, broadly speaking, to the development of man and the fullness of man. Now, in the second part of the report, building on a recent World Bank a recent study at the World Bank, but also weaving in examples from Catholic organizations, the idea is to look in particular as to whether schools do fulfill that mission of sharing values and to some extent faith to the children, and whether we can use data on violence in schools as a test, and also how we can make sure that schools do not have violence and that they are inclusive so that they promote indeed that vision of integral human development. And the mission of the schools, actually, which is to reach the periphery, if you will. Now, the World Bank study that I mentioned looked at the impact of violence in schools on learning and on schooling. These impacts are pretty large. I won't go into the details, and there is an estimation, which I'm not going to explain here, that the cost of violence in schools globally is very large, of the order of $11 trillion. The impacts on health and the well-being of the child of violence in schools, and also actually where the schools are inclusive, are even larger. And we are talking here about injuries, risky behaviors, alcohol, drugs, sex, lack of trust in others, subjective well-being in health, not feeling safe, etc., etc. We find that there are large negative effects of violence in schools on all of those outcomes. What is the most important part of the analysis is the recommendations in terms of how can we improve the function of the schools, if you will, or the safety in the schools, so that children enjoy going to school and are able to develop different skills. Well, there are a number of examples related, for example, to social-emotional skills or programs to end bullying that can be suggested. And all of those programs, from an economic argument, tend to have high benefit to cost ratios, but more fundamentally, the moral argument for those programs and for making schools safe and inclusive is probably even stronger. I mean, the experience that the children have in school is going to have lasting impacts on how they will behave as adults for many, many years to come. Now, I'm going to pass on the idea of engaging all stakeholders, but Catholic schools and other institutions tend to do that. I do want to mention that many of those programs that can make schools safer for children and promote the values of integral human development are not very costly. And I realize I'm going a bit late on time here, so I'm not going to go through all the measures, but this is one example from a program in Uganda, the Good School Toolkit, that actually has very low costs, especially after a scale-up of a few years. It's really affordable, and many of the programs, not all, but many of the programs that deal with other aspects of inclusivity, including, for example, making sure that children with disabilities are welcomed in schools, are actually not that expensive either. And the report will provide a number of those examples. Now, there are very interesting experiences in Catholic schools, but we should be careful not to generalize. In some countries, and the USA is one of them, there is actually much lower levels of violence in schools, in religious schools, as opposed to public schools. And that comes from survey data. In Uganda, where I mentioned before, the Good School Toolkit program had been implemented, actually we don't see any difference, practically speaking, between faith-based and public schools. So we have to be very careful not to say that Catholic schools or other religious schools always do better on those dimensions. That is not necessarily the case. But one of the things that the report will do is provide a set of interesting experiences. And I would just want to mention a few. How do you actually know whether there is violence in your school and what the students actually can do about it, or what the school can do? Well, I mean, Sister Marianne Culpert sent me some information which I found very interesting in Nigeria, where she implemented very simple surveys, which are web-based, so they are anonymous, and where the students could explain whether they were victims of violence and whether the schools managed to do something about it and what would be their suggestions to do something about it. And this is just a dozen questions. It's very informative, very useful. There are programs that Catholic schools are implementing to reduce violence or to promote inclusivity. And Anne Baker in South Africa has recently written a paper with one of those examples. And another thing that I found very interesting is the experience of Father Alexandre Bingo. And this is not South Africa, it's actually Burkina Faso. I have a small mistake there. Where he manages a school in Burkina Faso in an area which is multi-faith. A large number of children are Muslim in the Catholic secondary school, and there's a lot of programs that they implement so that the faith of each other is highly respected, with the Muslim children celebrating the belief of the Catholics and Protestants, and vice versa. And again, I mean, he has written a very nice paper that describes those practical experiences to make schools inclusive. In this particular case, inclusive with respect to the faith of the students, so that the schools actually welcome everybody. And we'll have more experiences from our panelists today of some of their experiences. If you do have experiences that you would like to share and that I might be able to introduce or integrate as examples in the forthcoming report, please do send them to me, but very quickly, because the report is now being finalized. So I think I've taken about 20 minutes, which was the time that was allocated to me. I just want to say one last word about the Global Catholic Education Project. You have the website, you can Google it, you have an email there. The idea is to provide, again, resources to Catholic educators and others interested in integral human development through a blog, through publications, through good practices, events and webinars such as today. All of this is completely volunteer-led, so if you want to be involved, please do contact us. This is the end of my presentation. I will stop sharing. I wanted to broadly give a picture of the very large networks that the Catholic Church manages to contribute to integral human development. A focus on safe and inclusive schools as really a foundation to prepare the children, to educate them, as the Congregation for Catholic Education would say, to fraternal humanism. And then finally, a few examples. And we'll have a much more detailed discussions with our panelists. Thank you again.
Well, thank you very much, Quentin. I mean, obviously, as you know, the principle of integral human development is a core principle today introduced into Catholic social thought by Popular and Progressio. And we've benefited today from your presentation that allows us to see the ways that this moves from a principle into action, and the contribution the church itself has played into helping to advance this principle. So we're very appreciative of that. And our continued panelists will be able to help us get more of a sense of how this happens, both on the ground and through their own research. So I'd invite our panelists at this point to unmute themselves and to turn on their screen. And I will briefly read out your bios. But just for our audience's sake, know that you can follow the link that we're posting in the chat now to be able to read full bios of all of our presenters. But we're joined today by Katherine Marshall, who is a senior fellow at the Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs at Georgetown University, where she leads the center's work on religion and global development, and a professor of the practice of development, conflict, and religion in the Wash School of Foreign Service. We're also joined by Patrizio Piraino, who is Associate Professor of Education, Labor, and Development in the Q School of Global Affairs at the University of Notre Dame, and Director of the Ford Program in Human Development Studies and Solidarity at the Kellogg Institute for International Studies at the University of Notre Dame. He is an applied economist with a focus on education, labor, and development, with particular expertise in issues related to global socioeconomic mobility. And finally, we're also joined by Diana Filatova, who is Program Officer for Europe, Central Asia, and Cambodia for the International Catholic Education Bureau, or BICE, B-I-C-E. She is also manages BICE's program addressing violence against children. Once more, thank you for joining us today and helping to further deepen the conversation that we've already had presented by Quentin today. I'm just going to start with some questions for each of our panelists, then move to a broader conversation for our full panel. And finally, I will also open up questions from the audience. And just to remind you, as our audience members, you can pose a question at any time using the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. And we'll even be inviting people to ask some of their questions live today. You can also see that some of these questions are already being answered. So Diana, you manage programs for the International Catholic Child Bureau. Could you give us a few examples of such programs and share some of the challenges and opportunities that you face within your work?
Sure. Indeed, the International Catholic Child Bureau works on different issues related to children's rights, as violence against children, rights of children with disabilities, or juvenile justice. And here I would like to give examples of two interventions promoting the right to education and safe schools. So the first one is a project we are implementing in Cambodia for rural children who can't access public schools because they're too far away from their villages and the road is not safe or adapted for small children. So to address this issue, our organization, in cooperation with our local partner in Cambodia, established non-formal schools in the villages with the teachers selected from the community and trained to follow the curriculum of the Ministry of Education. So in this way, children can learn every day in these villages classes instead of going to work in the field or to fish with their parents. And when they become big enough to make the journey to the public school, they can pass an equivalency exam and continue their education in a public school. All the villagers are closely involved in the project as they contribute to the construction and maintenance of the schools, non-formal schools, through the created parents' associations. And parents and children learn about children's rights and leadership so they can have necessary skills to promote it after the end of the projects. We also train teachers from formal and non-formal schools about nonviolent education, so they can elaborate and follow simple code of conduct, accessible and known by all children and parents. And the second project I wanted to give as an example is our project on violence prevention and support for children victims. We implement in 4 countries in Latin America and 5 countries in Eastern Europe. So the prevention work is done in schools, first of all with children, to explain different types of violence, how to identify, avoid, or report them. We use different methodologies and tools, like short films. It can be comics, it can be thematic discussions or games adapted to children's age and level of development. And different types of violence are treated, depends on what children wanted to learn or the local issues or problems. We know in the country or in the region or in the particular place we are working, like bullying, it can be online violence, sexual violence, intimate partner violence, corporal punishment, etc. So to make such work efficient, we also train school teachers and psychologists or social workers, depends on how to recognize violence, how to listen to child disclosure, and which is very important in some cases, to whom and how report the cases of violence. We also support volunteer schools in development, improvement, or evaluation of the internal child protection policies. So to be sure that these places are really safe for kids. And obviously, among the challenges, I have to mention the COVID-19 pandemic, all related restrictions like school closures, restrictions on community-based activities, and the heavy consequences it had in the countries we are working, like economic crisis with the resurgence of humanitarian needs for many families, and the rise of violence against children and reports on this violence. There is also insufficient state engagement and budgeting in many fields of our work, child protection, right to education, and difficulties for the development of the local civil societies in some countries because of lack of national funding and lack of some independency of civil society, and also restrictive legislation we can have in some countries on functioning or advocacy activities of NGO. And yes, and among the opportunities, I can name the strong engagement of the local communities, local NGOs, families, volunteers really engaged in the development and implementation of the projects. The multi-sector cooperation, which is quite functioning between the communities, civil society, and local authorities. And as Ivan said before, insufficient, but some progress exists on the policy level. For example, with ratification in the country, in some countries we are working in, of the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities for the promotion of inclusive education, laws on inclusive education, or some strategic plans on education with sufficient budgeting. So all these progresses are still very helpful to make our work more sustainable, which can sustain after the end of concrete projects.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Patrizio, you manage the Ford program at University of Notre Dame. Could you also give us a few examples of the research that takes place under the program, and then share some of the challenges and opportunities that you face?
Sure, thank you. Well, first of all, really thank you for organizing this. It's very interesting, and it's a nice and large group of people. So I'm very happy to join. Let me start by saying what the Ford program is, and then give some examples of what we do. And even just by telling you what the program is, you see that the Catholic, being Catholic is the driving force of the program, really. So this is a program within the Kellogg Institute where we try to provide a safe space for researchers to engage in questions that may not necessarily lead them to the type of publications or outputs that are rewarded by academia. Although in most cases they do result in that, and sometimes in very high quality ones, but it's just the sort of initial risk of taking on questions that perhaps in a sense academia is not ready for or is not standard. And the type of questions are exactly about going beyond sort of narrow focus of limited, unidimensional outcomes and things like this, and more to the sort of looking at the person as this complex object of study, but also looking at the person as somebody who has innate dignity, and we want to understand what are the various barriers to fully express and develop that human dignity. So this is the space, and it's easier, of course, it's easy to create such a space in a Catholic university like the one I work for. But I think just the idea of the place itself, I think it's already an answer partially to your question. In terms of our projects, what do we do? So we fund and do research in low and middle income countries. And we do this through long-term partnerships. So that's one distinctive feature of our projects. We avoid, in fact, we try to avoid what could be seen as exploitative research, the sort of touch and go, I get a publication, I don't know what you get, and I don't see you again. But rather we go to places where there is an existing long-term commitment and where we are accountable for what we do in those communities by being, again, following up years later, some of the partners who are also co-researchers with us. So that the long-term commitment is really a key characteristic of the projects we do. I'll give you an example. In Nairobi, where most of our activities at the moment take place, we are very well connected with the Holy Cross brothers and fathers there. Holy Cross is the same order that manages the University of Notre Dame. And so, especially in this community called Dandora in Nairobi, where, again, the Holy Cross has a church and has a clinic and has a number of very long-standing connections. So through this partnership, we are able to do research that it's otherwise difficult to do. And most importantly, we are able to answer questions that the community wants to be answered. So it's sort of an approach where the question, the research, what we call a research question, for them is an urgent need. I'm a mother, I need this type of assistance before my child becomes 5. What can I do? And so then we bring interdisciplinary teams to sort of help the local community, again, driven by their needs, in a way that with our skills, our technical skills, if you will, can contribute to a better understanding of what they tell us are their urgent needs. So this community-driven research approach, this is one example. Still in the same community, I can use the example again of this clinic. It's called the Brother Andre Clinic, where it started almost as a dispensary, as a small pharmacy, and now it's becoming a hospital essentially. And for instance, one thing we're testing now is the possibility, violence was mentioned in today's meeting. We're studying together with some psychologists, we're trying to study the potential effect of an intervention that can, which is essentially therapeutic intervention for women who have been subject to interpartner violence, which unfortunately there's high prevalence in the area. Again, this is coming from an observation from the community. Essentially, the clinic sees these women coming and for other reasons, and then the violence comes out, and then they realize, okay, we don't really have yet a well-designed intervention to help these women who have been subject to this type of situations. And as you can imagine, these are life scarring events. So anything we can do, it will be of high human value. I'll give one more example, and then I'll talk a little bit about some challenges. Another example, just to change area, in Peru, again, in a sort of low-income urban setting, and again, an interdisciplinary team trying to help women who are expecting, or pregnant women. And again, similar multidisciplinary approach in which some combination of therapeutic psychological intervention plus some sociological understanding of the economic and social constraints that bring certain people to make wrong choices when they're pregnant. What again, what they define as being wrong choices. We don't define it for them. So that's another project that it's currently underway. Let me conclude with this, some idea of I want to give you an idea of the kind of challenges we have when we collaborate with these Catholic organizations around the world, Catholic churches. Sometimes one of the challenges is that the scale of their operations is not very large. And I'm not talking about big things like Catholic relief services. I'm talking really about the parish in this village or the small school in this other area. Sometimes the scale is not large enough, so there is no enough forgive me the technicality, data points in a sense. We don't have enough information to even put together an interesting question, so to speak. But we know that there is an urgent need. So then what happens is that we try through the local connections, we try to increase the scale, perhaps by including Catholic organization, perhaps by including the government, still starting from the local Catholic connections, which are very wide. So this is really one of the challenges that we encounter in some of these places. I would say that in my personal experiences, one of the problems that was mentioned earlier about are we actually reaching the poor or not? I have to say that in my experience, through the connections that we have with Catholic organizations, mostly in Africa, I would say the answer is yes, actually. They are serving what economically would be described as the lowest ranks of the income distribution. So in that case, I would say that there is what you may call good targeting of the activities of the Catholic organizations there. I'm going to stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Patrizio. It's wonderful to not just see research into the work of Catholic organizations around the world, but almost a Catholic agenda for research by taking this fuller understanding of the human person that was really first pushed for through this idea of integral human development and developing a research agenda out of that. And it seems as well that this could also be a small c Catholic approach as well, something that could be attractive to scholars who are not coming from a Catholic perspective, but nonetheless are drawn into this. And it's also striking to see that you don't take the distance of the researcher, but that the school as well gets involved in to help ramp up these important efforts taking place on the ground. So thank you for your contributions. Katherine, turning to you, thus far we've sort of seen from Diana and Patrizio examples of great projects on the ground implemented by Catholic organizations, and you've been working in the international development field for many years. Where do we stand today in terms of the recognition of the role of faith-based organizations in development, and what do we need to do to make the international community more supportive of that role?
The topics that we're discussing today are critical and very central to the whole discussion of international development, but there still is what I would describe as a very patchy approach to taking into account what we're talking about today, which is the very substantial and diverse roles that the Catholic system as a whole is playing in critical development issues. So there are some institutions and some people which are looking quite professionally and systematically in an integral way, but others that are not. I think you did not mention in the beginning that both Quentin and I share long experience working in the World Bank. And so we've been wrestling with this issue over the years. And in a sense, there's been an up and down trend with some people, some countries, some of the member countries quite uneasy about an explicit focus on the religious dimension, whereas others see this as something that is very important. On education, which is largely what we're talking about, and health and social protection, as you can see, I mean, I think it comes very clearly through the presentation that we heard that taking into account this very large body of knowledge and experience in broader issues of education policy, health policy, and social protection is absolutely critical. And these issues, I think, have come out quite starkly during the COVID pandemic, where I think they're even more obvious than they have been for a long time. So the work that we do, just to clarify, at the Berkeley Center, but it also was work that we were doing when I was at the World Bank. I left in 2006, was really sort of saying with any given problem, violence against children or disability or other issues, what does the religious element, including, of course, the Catholic, have to do with it? How large is it? So what Quentin describes as market share. Interestingly, Quentin never gave us the denominators. He's focusing very much on the numerators, but the denominators, the sort of share issue, is one that we need to know in order to be more persuasive at ensuring that these issues are taken into account. And then the other question, which again is only hinted at in the discussion so far, is what does this have to do with policy decisions? In other words, it matters, but how and who should do what? We talk a lot about who's at the table, but you have to define then which table you're talking about and what to do about it. So I think that there are a number of issues that are very prominent right now on the global agendas, where I personally would like to see much more professional and systematic engagement between some of the silos. So the first one is the very deep and widespread concern about the quality of education. Essentially, the storyline globally, so you had very rapid expansion of access to education, really quite a remarkable story, but you have very serious quality issues. So clearly in this case, what is the experience of different groups, whether it's the Fe Alegria network or this extraordinary expansion in so many different African countries? And one of the issues one has to look at is that the profile is very different according to the country. Remember that there are 54 countries in Africa. Each one has its own story. In some cases, all the schools were nationalized, the missionary schools then denationalized. So you have a very complex country-specific, context-specific challenge. But there is an enormous experience that is coming with this massive global quality issue. And then that bleeds into issues of what are you teaching? In other words, is it really preparation for jobs, or is it a broader goal for education to make, to develop the kinds of citizens that you need in the world today in the 21st century? The second issue, which again is very stark in the COVID crisis, is the intergroup tensions in many societies and the roles that educational institutions can and do or do not play in helping people to learn to live together. And again, that's a major central research question that I think has always been there. It was there in the Balkans, there in many, many different countries, including the United States, I would emphasize. But the question is, with the sort of COVID crisis and the expansion of tensions, how does that come into the, how does the religious dimension, the Catholic dimension, come into the picture? And I think that's true for education. It's true for health policy, even for vaccinations, which is a very central preoccupation that we're working on now, and on all of the issues of social protection. I think that the other issue, which is the focus of this remarkable report, I mean, I hats off to Quentin and to all of you for pulling this together in an accessible form. But this issue of violence is very troubling. And the Berkeley Center at Georgetown and Georgetown University are very much focused on some of the issues of violence and abuse within the Catholic Church. So let's be very honest and open that that is a piece of the story, but it is part of a much broader issue of violence in society. One study of domestic violence had a statistic that I read long ago that half of the women who have faced domestic violence have never spoken about that to a living soul. So you have this extraordinary challenge of a hidden, often unacknowledged problem, which again, the COVID crisis with its focus, with its accentuation of inequalities and the tensions and mental health issues that have come out so starkly has these issues. So my sort of summary of this is that this experience, first of all, is valuable. The numbers are extraordinarily valuable and impressive, and the source, the work that's done, is remarkable. But I think it opens up the whole set of the questions that I'm pointing to, and some of them just implying of what are the questions we need to ask about this vast experience, and how can we work more effectively to bring that into the broader policy dialogue. So I'll stop there.
Great. And in the interest of time for our panelists, I'm just going to merge sort of our last two questions together. And after this sort of set of moderated conversations, we're going to move to audience Q&A. So feel free to continue to post questions through the chat, and we'll be allowing certain folks to even give voice to their questions. For all of you here on the panel, we've been looking at, when we're doing econ research, we're looking at a scale that's often large. I want to hone in just a bit on the personal here to ask you in a personal way whether there's a particular person or group of persons that's inspired the work that you're doing, that's helped drive you to focus on this fuller picture of the human. Could be a mentor or a person you're able to help, or some person whose writings touched you. But then also, by way of sort of a conclusion of this portion, what do you feel is the most important work that the Catholic Church or Catholic organizations could do today to help promote integral human development today? What should be our priorities? So two-part question, and really invite anyone to take the floor. Patrizio, perhaps I'll turn to you first.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, so I'm gonna, in terms of the inspiration, I'm gonna mention a group of people, which is, so I spent a good portion of my career in South Africa, and before moving to the US. That's actually where I'm calling you from today. I'm in Cape Town. I'm kind of stuck here, but that's another story. So the group of people I want to recognize their influence on me is South African government officials, sort of mid-level government officials in various departments: education, labor, a little bit of higher education as well, monitoring and evaluation. And what they taught me, what I saw in these people through some collaborations, through some field work and common interest, what I learned is that it is possible to be a public servant. So in their case, that's their call. They're serving the public, and I don't want to say that this is true for everyone, but I met many like this, which is a true call to actually serve the people who interact with those offices, whether it be the unemployment office or the school, provincial authority, whatever it is. And it was truly inspiring. I'll just say one anecdote. I was in a rural area where we were trying some job search assistance program. And there was one of the counselors there who was clearly interested in the well-being of these job seekers. This is people who may have been unemployed for a long time, who had some real needs for them and their families. And just the inspiration of actually taking the time to understand the individual complexity, again, the fuller person, the aspirations, the experiences that led you to that moment of being unemployed, to the spell of unemployment. And that was really inspiring to me, because as an economist, we sometimes tend to take averages and really just, give you the predicted value of something or the average effect of something. And here you see these people on the ground without the same economics training I have, being able to see things that I was missing. And for me, that was really, really, truly inspiring. So that's my example. I'll let other people contribute their own experiences.
Great. Open floor for anyone.
Well, maybe I'll jump in. I came to this work on the what's religion got to do with integral development, with development, more or less by accident. I was drafted by the president of the World Bank at the time, Jim Wolfenson, because he had started this project. And it has been quite a remarkable journey, learning journey. And I have sort of two comments on that have some personal stories attached to them. First of all, I do go back always to one of my more ornery professors in graduate school, who constantly asked uncomfortable questions. And I think that the World Bank, Georgetown University, the development field is very much in need of opening up to these larger questions, because in this world, this complicated world, another image that I come back to all the time is the blind men and the elephant, that we're seeing different parts of a very complex reality and interpreting it in very different ways. So to look at what we're talking about today, the sort of Catholic school issue is one very important window into the broader education debate, and some of the ways that you think about education and its purpose. But it often is asking different questions and looking at things in different ways. I think my own experience when I was working at one point, both with Fe Alegria across Latin America, and also Aushall, these sort of Jesuit influenced universities, there were very, very different questions that people were asking and ways of looking. And to me, that is a profoundly important challenge to what people might call development studies. So I think that the way that this event today is focused on basically getting a grip on the statistics and the trends is a first step in a much longer and more complicated journey.
And great, Diana. Any contributions either to the first question I posed or the second one in terms of most important work that the Catholic Church or Catholic organization should do?
About the inspiration, I wanted to mention here the work done by Amy Werner. She's an American development psychologist. If you know her, she and her team have conducted a 40-year study of about 700 children on the Hawaiian island of Kauai, with the initial hypothesis that children exposed to reproductive and environmental risk factors like mentally ill parents or unstable households will go on to experience more problems with delinquency, mental and physical health, and family stability when they are adults. However, she and her team found that 1/3 of all these high-risk children displayed what is now called resilience, and they developed into caring, competent, confident adults despite their problematic development histories. And she identified some protective factors which helped them as a strong bond with caretaker, involvement in church or in community, and having a skill which give them a sense of pride. And her study showed us that protective factors found in these resilient children served as kind of a buffer against the negative effect of the risks. So this is why this is very inspiring for me, and I think it's her finding can be used in our work. All children, even if they have experienced violence, delinquency, health problems, disability, discrimination, poverty, crisis, conflict, should receive our support, and we should encourage these protective factors so to help them to grow in healthy and fulfilled adults. So for me, this is inspiration and advice for us to encourage this internal children resilience.
Fantastic. Well, thank you. We're now going to turn to our audience members here to pose some questions for the audience. And the first one coming from Lori Kelleher. Lori, we're going to give you the opportunity to ask your question live. And Lori, if you are here with us, if you could unmute yourself, and we'd invite you to pose the question.
Sorry, I was struggling with the mic there. Thank you very much. Thank you. This is such an interesting panel. I'm interested in, like everyone here, interested in integral human development, excuse me. And I'm wondering, as I'm a philosopher, and so as a philosopher, I look at not all the tools that we have to measure these sorts of things, but the concepts behind them. It seems to me, doing philosophical analysis, that most of what we're doing with integral human development isn't about certain results, about although these play a factor, how many students get degrees, but it's more of a change of heart or a change of mindset or a change of feelings, not just for people who are struggling and impoverished, but for the people who are privileged and powerful as well, because integral human development is for the whole person and every person. So my question is, are there tools that assess this sort of relatively difficult to assess change and how we live our lives and the complete person? So do we as people working in policy, working in economics, have this sort of tool set to measure the sort of change of this softer, I don't want to say softer because it makes it sound like they're not as important, but these very important ways of how we do things, like in the example that Patrizio gave of this person asking all the right questions and considering the entire person. Can we measure that somehow? Do we have tools for that? Thank you.
Thank you, Lori.
I mean, I can say a few things and then others can compliment me, Michael, perhaps. So there is no magic tool, right? That's clear. I mean, these are very complicated questions. But the whole point, for example, if you look at education, is to go beyond test scores, which measure learning, and which is what everybody is focusing on. And there are so many other dimensions, right? So if you think, for example, about the experience of the child in schools, yes, there are surveys which are typically school health surveys that allow you to look at many different aspects of the behavior of the child, as well as the perceptions of the schools of the child and so on, in other dimensions as well. If you just look even at volunteering or giving to charity or helping strangers, I always thought that 3 questions in the Gallup poll were very, very interesting on that. And one of the findings that I found very surprising or fundamental, actually, is that, extreme poverty is not only an issue of income, it's an issue of being excluded. And you can actually show that people who are much less educated, who are in extreme poverty, have much less occasions in their life to give to charity, to volunteer their time, to help strangers. And this is, of course, not because they are less altruistic. It's just because they are not in a situation in their life where it would be easier for them to do those things. And so, I mean, even the value surveys and so on, there are lots of different surveys. There's no magic instrument, but there are different types of data that can be used. And what I think is important, if I take again the example of schools, is that there are also tools that schools can use to assess how well they are doing on all of those non-learning metrics kind of dimensions, right? So it's not perfect, but I think there is more and more research in those areas. And I think the three of the panelists probably have examples as well.
I think Quentin gave a good answer. What I'm finding in discussions, and this takes into account the many, many different public and private actors who are involved, particularly in education, I think, but also in what we are calling social protection, is this very fundamental questions. In the case of education, is what is education about? And a constant focus on values, sort of how do you teach values? How do you define values? And how do you obviously do you assess whether your system, your school system has been effective in values? Now, the area that's very central, that's an immediate preoccupation. I was just at a meeting where it was the central focus last week, is this question of learning to live in plural societies and understanding sort of civic values when people come with very strong religiously inspired values. And what are the ways, first of all, that within your overall systems that you have a variety of people that you get to know in your school days and interact with, having diversity within Catholic schools, for example, and how does that work, and how is that managed in the school? But then also looking to later life when you have intensive conflicts among different communities, as we sadly have in so many societies, whether it's ethnic, religious, class, geography, or whatever. So I think the answer to the question is yes, there are interesting studies and tools, but I think even more there are constant questions about what it is we're trying to do. What is the meaning of well-being? What is the meaning of human development? What's the meaning of human? What's the meaning of development? Integral. All of these terms are much more contested than we allow ourselves to admit a lot of the time.
The question made me think about our work on violence against children, and the fact that violence against children, one of the cause is the social norms and behaviors authorizing violence against children, and one of the main identified strategies to change it is to elaborate projects aiming to change these negative social norms and behaviors and turn them to positive ones. So there is an interesting document elaborated by the Global Partnership to End Violence Against Children about the inspired strategies of how to end violence. And there's one strategy dedicated to social norms and behaviors, with some interesting practices evaluated by different scholars on these changes and how it's changed then the number of cases, the prevalence of violence against children. So it can be an interesting reading.
Great. And in the interest of time, I'm just going to pose one last question. And Patrizio, we'll start with you as a respondent. But this is from Brother Peter joining us from Bethlehem University. A great reminder that we have obviously administrators, scholars, and potentially those stewarding students in our midst, or even students joining us today. So from each of your perspectives, what is one important research question that needs to be pursued? And so just very quick responses from folks. One research question from your perspective that needs to be pursued to help advance future researchers out there. Patrizio?
Yeah, the difficult question. You want to start with me? I'd say I'll tell you what I'm prioritizing, and in fact, we're a group of people doing that, and I think also the economists in the Credo group are also doing that. One thing is for me, which kind of links to the previous question about how do you go from economic impact or psychological impact to social impact, human impact. So for me, what we're doing now is trying to connect the tools we have to get rigorous impact of different, policies or different things, and combine that with a normative vision of what we actually want to achieve beyond the small one-dimensional impact. So, and I would say that there's a Catholic advantage in that because we are raised thinking like that. Most of my priests growing up were Franciscans, so it was all about, being simple and understanding the dignity of the human being even in poverty and things like that. So for me it is that trying to connect, and it's easier said than done, trying to connect these very sophisticated tools we have in all these disciplines with normative vision of what dignity is and how you improve human dignity.
Great, thank you. Others? Katherine, Diana? No. Quentin, final question for researchers that you would suggest that they pick up?
Well, to me, and I'm an economist like Patrizio, right? So I tend to deal with numbers, but what I think is more important is actually not the numbers, and I think Patrizio thinks the same. So to me, the question would be, how can we find ways credibly to gather the massive information that comes from lived experiences for people who are engaged on the ground in Catholic organizations and non-Catholic too, by the way, right? How do we find a way to bring that to the fore in a convincing way, so that we don't do, like it seems to be now the fad in development, base all our recommendations on whether we have a randomized controlled trial on something, which I think misses that very richness of what people are actually doing every day that actually works, even if they cannot prove it with a fancy data set and model. So the more we can find ways to share those experiences on the ground in a meaningful way, in a credible way that matters for policy, the more impact I think we are going to have.
Great. Diana.
Just one word. I don't know, I'm not a researcher, so I don't know how much it's a researchy question, but for me it will be very important to work more on participation and how we can connect and encourage the participation of people we actually support, and connect the researchers, the NGO, the Catholic Church with people, so they can participate on all the levels at the elaboration of a project, evaluation, research on this. So all this question of participation will be the most important for me.
Thank you. Quentin, I'm going to hand it over to you for just a penultimate word before I close this out. Certainly people are wondering how they can get access to this report, how they can get access to everything. So I hand it to you.
Sure, very quickly. So I think we'll release the report before mid-January, perhaps actually even at the end of December. If there are experiences that you know about or that you are personally involved with that you think we should reflect. I mean, we are looking for those experiences that we can put in boxes and things like that. I mean, I wanted to mention that we asked Diana, Katherine, and Patrizio to be part of this panel because we know that they are all three doing great works and their organizations as well, the university and then the International Child Catholic Bureau. But in closing, I would say if you want to contribute to this project that we call the Global Catholic Education Project, which is again completely volunteer-led, by sharing your experiences, by sharing your analysis, or by suggesting things that we should look at, please do send us an email. Thank you.
Thank you. And please join me in thanking our distinguished panel for really fantastic contributions today. And thank you for joining us and for being participants in today's discussion. You can join our mailing list today to stay tuned for future programs. It's at Economics and Catholic Social Thought and Dialogue. And as Quentin suggested, you'll be able to find more details on the report at Global Catholic Education, at the Global Catholic Education website. We're posting it in the chat there. Once more, I'm grateful for the organizers and co-sponsors who helped ensure today's success, including Credo, Grace, OYEC, IFCU, the OMAEC, UMECWUTC, BICE, the Q School of Global Affairs at the University of Notre Dame, America Media, the Collegium Institute, the Harvard Catholic Forum, the Nova Forum, St. Anselm Institute, and the St. Benedict Institute. I'd like to thank the interpreters who've joined us today, who are helping to make this conversation accessible within Spanish and within English, in French as well. And finally, I invite you to support us today. Help get word out to friends and parishes, follow us on social media, and help share materials like programs like this to those who would benefit from it. And you can become a financial supporter of Lumen Christi's work today at lumenchristi.org/donate, helping us to continue to provide programs like these for free to viewers like you. But otherwise, once more, please join me in thanking our distinguished panel. And we are grateful for being able to bring a conversation like this to you all. Thank you and have a wonderful evening and a great rest of your day.